Well, hey, I'm Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass, and I don't know when you're watching this, but for me, it's Easter Sunday. And because of that, I'm wondering, did you get a visit from the Easter Bunny last night? I've always loved the Easter Bunny because he leaves a basket full of candy outside my room. That's also full of that plastic grass that no matter how hard you try to clean it up, you're still gonna find pieces of it hiding out in your house at Christmas. But kids love the Easter Bunny. Well, most kids do. Some kids have a different take altogether.
Emma, look behind you.
Easter Bunny. That's the Easter Bunny. Look at the Easter Bunny.
Some kids are just not fans of the Easter Bunny. Let me show you my favorite reaction video.
Coming to see you all tonight.
The Easter Bunny!
Yep. Look at your pretty eggs.
Mommy, can we pick them out?
No, don't bother them yet. They're still drying.
Some kids are skeptical of the Easter Bunny, and maybe they should be. He doesn't make any sense. I mean, this is what a bunny looks like, and this is what the Easter Bunny looks like. One of these things is not like the other. But it's not just how he looks. The Easter Bunny doesn't make sense with what we know about the real world. Bunnies don't grow to human size, put on a bow tie, sneak into our houses, and lay eggs outside of our bedroom doors while we're sleeping. It just doesn't happen. They don't work that way. And as a result of that, some kids just can't suspend their disbelief. They're skeptics. In the same way, there are people who are skeptical of Jesus. I mean, every Easter, we celebrate that Jesus rose from the dead. But for many people, that just doesn't make sense with what we know about the real world, because people don't rise from the dead. And because there are those who can't suspend that disbelief, they become skeptics. For a lot of people, the story of Easter is so broken that it's absolutely unbelievable. It might surprise you to know this, that Jesus' followers were skeptics too. Look at Mark chapter 16, verse 9. It says this: after Jesus rose from the dead early on Sunday morning, the first person who saw him was Mary Magdalene. She went to the disciples who were grieving and weeping and told them what had happened. But when she told them that Jesus was alive and that she'd seen him, they didn't believe her. Jesus' disciples didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. And they had a lot of good reasons not to. One reason is that women were the first to witness this. Now, that may not be a big deal in our world, but in their world, women couldn't testify in court. Their testimony couldn't be trusted. Women were looked down on. And a story like this would require at least two men to verify that it happened. So why in the world would Jesus appear to women if he wanted his resurrection to be validated? That's just a dumb way to start a religion. The other reason that the disciples were skeptics is, again, that people don't rise from the dead. And can we just be honest? Just because these people lived 2,000 years ago doesn't mean they were stupid. Even in the ancient world, people were aware of the fact that dead people don't just randomly come back to life. And since Jesus was dead, the disciples didn't believe in him anymore. There was nothing to believe in. He wasn't alive. But something happened that changed that. So what took this movement that died with Jesus and reignited it? And to discover that, we need to look at Peter, who was one of Jesus' closest disciples, who was a man who went from skeptic to someone who worked to convince skeptics. Now, about 5 weeks after Jesus died, there were 120 or so people, including the disciples, who were praying together in a room. Now, the book of Acts tells us that while they were praying, a huge gust of wind blasted through the room, and then flames appeared over their heads, and they started speaking in languages that they didn't know, but that the people who were outside understood. Now, I know that that's all really weird if you're a skeptic, and you're probably thinking that Chris, this isn't helping your cause, but let's just plop all that to the side for now. Here's what matters. People are gathering to see what's going on, and Peter takes the opportunity to talk to the crowd. And this is what he says in Acts 2:22. People of Israel, listen. God publicly endorsed Jesus the Nazarene by doing powerful miracles, wonders, and signs through him, as you well know. So Peter stands up and he says, guys, all this weird stuff you're seeing, all of this, all the miracles that he used to do, all of that is about Jesus. The crazy things you're seeing now, the miracles and wonders he performed then, that was all God endorsing Jesus. Now, if you're in the crowd, you might be thinking, well, I heard about the miraculous things that Jesus did, but Peter, that's not proof. It's not a reason I should follow Jesus. I mean, I've seen some pretty great magicians, and if sick people even did get better, it was probably psychosomatic. The human mind is a powerful thing. The point is that the people in the crowd had heard about Jesus' miracles, and yet they still didn't follow Jesus. They heard his amazing teaching and didn't follow him. And if you're a skeptic of this stuff, you aren't alone. Again, there were skeptics then. Peter continues in verse 23. But God knew what would happen, and his prearranged plan was carried out when Jesus was betrayed. With the help of lawless Gentiles, you nailed him to a cross and killed him. So I don't know why Peter says this, because it's just more proof that Jesus isn't worth following, particularly for the religious Jews. Because the Jewish Messiah, he's going to come and set up a new Jewish kingdom. He's going to overthrow Rome, who were their occupiers and oppressors. And Jesus can't be their king if he's dead. The true Messiah is not going to die. Peter continues in verse 24. But God released him from the horrors of death and raised him back to life. Okay, Peter, you can say that Jesus was raised from the dead. You can say almost anything. And there will be gullible people who believe it, which, by the way, is a phenomenon which still exists. Just look at Facebook and Reddit if you doubt me. But just because you say something doesn't mean it's true. Peter himself knew this because he wasn't going to be one of those gullible people who believed this story when Mary came and told him that Jesus was raised from the dead. He didn't believe her. And yet, 5 weeks later, he changed his tune, saying something that takes his claims of a risen Jesus from something that anyone could just say to something that could be tested and proven. Look at Acts 2:31. Peter said, God raised Jesus from the dead, and we are all witnesses of this. Peter says, we saw this. We are firsthand witnesses. This isn't just something we heard through the grapevine. It's something we actually saw. You're aware that Jewish law says there have to be two witnesses, two men, who testify to something in order to prove it's true, right? Well, forget 2 or 3 or even 12, because there are hundreds of us who saw Jesus, hundreds of eyewitnesses who can confirm that Jesus is alive. The Apostle Paul, he also said this, and look at how he put it in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, I passed on to you what was most important and what had also been passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the scripture said. He was buried, and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the Jewish scriptures said. He was seen by Peter and then by the 12. And get this, after that, he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. And then he was seen by James and later by all the apostles. And last of all, as though I had been born at the wrong time, I also saw him. Paul is saying that Jesus died and rose again. A minimum of 514 people saw Jesus alive. Most of them are also still alive, and you can go ask them. Get their stories. Check them against each other. Investigate this. It's okay. Our witness testimony can hold up against any questioning because this is true. Paul here echoes what Peter was saying in more detail. But back when Peter said this, after he made these crazy claims to a crowd of potential skeptics, look at how they responded in Acts 2:41. So those who believed what Peter said were baptized and added to the church that day, about 3,000 in all. Maybe you didn't know this about the first century church. Maybe you thought that their message was just that Jesus died and he rose from the dead. But there was more, and it's this. Jesus died, he rose from the dead, and we saw it. It's not just some mystical claim that you can believe or not, because Jeff saw Jesus, and so did Debbie from accounting. Go ask them. They will tell you. And this was a message that the very first Christians, that they hit over and over and over again. Let me show you some examples. Acts 3:15. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses of this fact. Acts 4:20. We cannot stop telling about everything we have seen and heard. Acts 5:32. We are witnesses of these things. Acts 10:41. We were those who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And then finally, Acts 13:30 through 31. But God raised him from the dead. And over a period of many days, he appeared to those who had gone with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to the people of Israel. If you're a skeptic, you may still be iffy on all of this because you're skeptical of religious and supernatural stuff, and that's okay. But there's one real thing that you can't be skeptical of, and that's human nature. The people who believed this and kept telling other people about Jesus, they were harshly persecuted. That's just history. They were arrested, imprisoned, and beaten. They lost all their possessions. They lost family members. They were tortured and killed for their beliefs. They were used as human torches by the Roman Emperor Nero. Now ask yourself this about human nature. If you made up a religion to profit from it, would you be willing to die for your own lie? Would you put your family, your children at risk? These first Christians, they confessed Jesus' resurrection even when it cost them everything. Now ask yourself, is it possible that a religious conspiracy that included hundreds of people telling the same lie could survive without even a small percentage of those people copping to that lie? But nobody did. None of the disciples, nearly all of whom were tortured and killed, confessed to lying about Jesus' resurrection when they were interrogated. Hundreds of men and women stuck to the story that they saw Jesus alive, even when it cost them everything. Even under the harshest interrogation, their stories held up. Enough that thousands and thousands of people who had never seen Jesus themselves believed in him too. See, Christianity is not just based on the Bible or a collection of religious writings that you have to suspend belief in order to accept. It's not based on one man's teaching or moral principles. Christianity is completely based on the fact that a historical Jesus died and rose from the dead, and people saw him. All the moral teachings and religious writings of the Bible are worthless without the resurrection of Jesus. Paul said as much in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. He says that if Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, that changes everything else. Because if a man can predict his death and resurrection and then it happens, everything else he said and did might be worth listening to. If Jesus really rose from the dead, it takes a broken and unbelievable story, and then it turns it into something beautiful. A story that begins in the brokenness of death, but doesn't end there. That ends instead in the beauty of new life for all of us in Jesus. As I wrap up, I want to address two groups of people that Easter is for. First, Easter for Christians, for those whose lives have been changed by Jesus. For us, Easter is an opportunity to celebrate what we know to be true, that Jesus died, he rose again, and people saw it. And his death and resurrection are the most important things because they mean that we get to experience death to our old broken lives that were full of shame, regret, and fear, and that now we can embrace new life in Jesus, lives full of hope, peace, and the love of God. And the second group are skeptics. Easter for skeptics. And if that's you, I want to encourage you to take these things to heart, even if it's only just a little bit. Is it possible that you haven't wrestled with the idea that Jesus rose from the dead because you just assumed it's the same as belief in the Easter Bunny, a myth? But is it possible that the historical evidence and that the weight of human nature 2,000 years ago, that they point to the fact that maybe it's more likely that Jesus rose from the dead than that he didn't. And if that's on the table, what does that mean about everything else he taught? Because if a man can predict his death and resurrection, and then it happens, what does that mean for everything else that he said about God and about God's relationship with us? Perhaps the message of Easter is that Jesus might be worth following after all. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.